In this lesson, we are going to create a MySQL table for the news section of the Stones River logging site.
All right.
Now, let's take a look at the news page on Stones River Logging. You can see we have various news entries, and these news entries are made up of different pieces of data. This is what we'll use to base our MySQL table on.
Okay.
And just by looking at this, we can see that we're going to need a few different fields. We're going to need a header field for the short header. We're going to need a headline field for the news headline, and we're going to need a news field to contain this information, the actual news itself.
Okay.
Now, there's a few other considerations. We were talking about the front, or in previous lessons, we were talking about the front page of Stones River Logging, and it has a news section right on the home page. Now, we want to be able to specify which news articles are actually shown on the front page. And the last thing that we'll need control over is whether or not news items are actually shown. We'll give ourselves the ability to activate and deactivate news items.
Okay.
That way, if we ever needed to remove one from the site, it wouldn't actually have to be deleted.
I gotcha. So it'll still be in the cache, but I mean, it'll still be in the, it'll still be there, but you won't actually physically delete it off there. It just won't be shown.
Exactly, just a way of hiding it off of the site.
I gotcha.
So let's take a look at creating this table now. We'll jump over to a blank text buffer to make it easier to work with the SQL before we enter it. So let's start this table. We are going to use create table. In this case, we're going to name the table news, and I'll put down the opening and closing parentheses as well as the terminator. Now, for the very first field, before we even get into all the information in regards to a news item, we're going to give ourselves an auto ID, much like in the test table in the MySQL section.
Okay.
We want to have a field that is indicated as the primary key, which will give us a unique ID back to each of our news records.
Okay.
So, we'll call this field auto ID, and it is going to be an int field. It will be unsigned, not null. Let's see, auto increment, and finally, it is the primary key. So primary key, like such. Add a comma so we can go on to another field. Now we start taking a look at the actual storage of our news data.
I gotcha.
The first thing, like we were talking about, is the header field. To store that store the short piece of text before the full headline.
Okay.
For header, we are going to use a varchar data type, and I'm going to limit this to 100, like such. Now, 100 in this case is going to be more than enough. Usually, the header is only a few words.
Right.
But since a varchar stores only the characters that are necessary, this doesn't present an inefficiency. We're simply using 100 to give a maximum length for the header field.
Okay.
Next will be the headline field. So let's say headline is also a varchar, and this time we're going to limit it to 200. So that gives us our header, our headline. Now let's take a look at the news block itself. Because older versions of MySQL may have a overall length limit on a varchar, something about 255 characters, we want to make sure that that limitation wouldn't present any problem if we were using an older MySQL version.
Okay.
And to get around this, we're going to make sure that our news field is a text field. This will allow far more than 255 characters.
Okay.
So we'll say that the actual news field is going to be of type text.
All right.
So that takes care of storing the actual data for a news item. Now let's create the fields that will allow us to control when news items are shown on the front page. Basically, whether this will give us the ability to feature news items. So we'll call this field featured, so we can see if each news item is featured or not.
Okay.
Now, featured is going to be used as an on-off value once we actually use it within the site.
Like a true-false?
Yeah, actually, that's the way we are going to use it. It is kind of like a boolean, a true-false. Though, in older versions of MySQL, there is no single bit field type. There is no way of storing only a true-false.
Okay.
Unless you want to get into other special types of fields. So what we're going to do is we're going to store it in an int field that is limited to a length of 1.
Okay.
And this will work just fine because we can have our code read 1 as go ahead and show or go ahead and feature and read 0s as hide. The other thing this does is gives us complete compatibility across all versions of the MySQL server.
Ah, I see.
So featured is going to be an int with a length of 1, and it is going to be unsigned. So this brings us to our final field, active. We're going to use active as the field that will tell whether or not a news item is displayed at all.
I see.
And again, give us the ability to temporarily hide a news item without needing to delete it.
Okay.
So we'll create our active field, and once again, it is going to be an int 1 unsigned. Like such. And of course, I'll leave off the final comma. Since this is the last field, we aren't specifying anymore.
Okay. I got a question real quick.
What's that?
I noticed that every time you make a table, you always use the auto ID. Is that just a general practice to put an auto ID on the front of all the tables?
Yes, it's not absolutely required, but it is a good practice.
Okay.
It is. It's a good thing to specify a primary key so that you have a unique ID back to a specific record.
Okay.
Plus, creating a key in that way will also help if you have a lot of data within the table. It'll speed up selects.
I see. So I can see how it could get confusing if you don't have an auto ID on there, and you have like 50 people with the letter T for the first letter of their username, and you want to select a specific person.
Right. It's always very handy to have a unique record back to each individual record within the table.
All right.
So yes, it is a good practice to follow to always have an auto ID.
Okay, I see.
It doesn't necessarily have to be named auto ID. You can name it whatever. Like in this case, we could have used news ID if we wished.
I see.
For this VTM, we're going to be going with auto ID for the primary key of all of our tables.
Okay.
So with that, let's go ahead and load this into the MySQL monitor and see how it works. So we'll switch over, and here we have the MySQL monitor loaded up, and we have the logging database selected.
I gotcha.
So I'm just going to paste this in, and we can see query is okay, so it has created our table for us.
Okay, cool.
So with this news table created, let's see, that's about all we need to cover in this lesson.
Okay.
Once again, we're just getting this table set up so that we have a place to store data once we get into creating the actual administration.
I see. So for future lessons, we just created this table for it.
Exactly.
Okay.
So with that, that's going to wrap up this lesson.